I remember that night, as if the wind itself carried it back to me, each gust heavy with memory. The Whitlo ranch stood alone against the wide prairie, its windows throwing weak lantern light across the grass, the old wood groaning as if it knew what was coming. Above, the sky was torn open with a scatter of stars, pale and watchful, and the silence between them felt endless. I swear the earth held its breath that night, waiting for footsteps it did not welcome. Inside, Eleanor Whitlo moved through her house like a woman made of both dust and steel. She was called Ellie by the few who dared, though most in town spoke her name behind their palms, wrapped in whispers. Her hands were strong from the plow and the rope, her face carrying the faint trace of a beauty softened by years of work. She lived half in shadow, half in light, always caught between grief and the stubborn will to keep breathing. On the mantel rested a photograph, the face of her late husband staring out with the steady gaze of a man who had once built fences and dreams with equal devotion. His chair by the fire had gone untouched for years, and she left it that way, as though moving it might scatter the last of his spirit. Ellie's solitude was not the quiet sort. It was the kind that bristled with judgment. In town, women pressed their lips together when she entered the mercantile, and men shifted their hats lower, as if her independence unsettled them. Rumors carried on the wind like burrs clinging to cloth. They said she kept a man at her place, not blood nor kin, and it was sin that bound them. Martha Jane, sharp-tongued and restless, led that chorus, feeding the town with scraps of poison. Yet Ellie held her head higher each time, her back stiff as a fence post, her silence her shield. She would not explain herself to those who thrived on tearing others thin. And there was Jonas Concaid, the drifter who stayed on her land. Nights found him near the corral, sharpening a knife under moonlight, his jaw marked by a scar that told more stories than his voice ever did. His past lay in shadows, stitched with mistakes and long miles. But on Ellie's land he moved with purpose. He fixed broken shutters without being asked, left bread on the table without asking for thanks, and mended the fence where the rails sagged. Between them lived a quiet understanding, unspoken and fragile. At supper, their eyes sometimes caught across the table, lingering not with longing, but with gratitude that had not yet dared to speak its name. That connection, tender, shy, unfinished, was the kind the world could never understand. To town gossip, Jonas was her shame. To Ellie, he was proof that hands scarred by hardship could still build rather than break. Yet no one knew the true thread tying him to her home. A debt he carried to Ellie's late husband, a promise whispered long ago to guard what was left behind. On that late afternoon, Ellie rode back from town with supplies. Her cheeks burned, not from the sun but from the sting of Martha Jane's words, still circling her like flies. She kept her chin high, but inside she felt the old ache pressing harder than usual. Jonas was already there when she arrived, quiet as ever, mending tack by the stable. He looked up only once, meeting her eyes with a flicker of something close to concern. She didn't speak of the whispers, and he didn't ask. Their silence was the kind that comforted. As the day stretched into dusk, the prairie seemed to shift. Somewhere on the horizon, 3 riders moved slow across the ridge, their shapes dark against the dying light. They rode with the kind of hunger that lived in their bones, the kind that turned men toward cruelty when the world gave them nothing else. From afar, they were only shadows, but the prairie itself seemed to bristle at their passing. Ellie hummed faintly while she cooked, her voice trembling against the crackle of the fire. Jonas sat outside, watching the sky bleed red into violet, sharpening his knife with strokes that slowed as if he, too, felt the coming change. Neither spoke of the unease hanging in the air, though both sensed it. The land itself felt too still, too expectant. Night fell hard, folding around the house like a heavy blanket. The lantern sputtered, its flame quivering against the glass. Ellie moved to set another log on the fire when a sound split the silence. The snap of wood, the groan of hinges forced past breaking. The door burst inward, splintering against the wall. 3 men filled the threshold, their boots heavy on the floorboards, their breath carrying whiskey and the scent of long, unwashed miles. The room seemed to shrink around them, their shadows swallowing the walls. Ellie's hand froze near the rifle by the hearth, but she did not lift it. She stood straight, her eyes wide, but unflinching, the flicker of the lantern catching the steel in her gaze. The tallest of them, Clyde Morrow, with a grin as cracked as old leather, looked her over and sneered. "Didn't reckon we'd find company out here," he growled, voice thick with menace. And just like that, the night that the prairie had been holding in its lungs began to exhale, slow, terrible, and inevitable. The house seemed to sag beneath their weight, as though its beams and rafters understood what kind of night had entered its walls. Ellie stood firm, her dress brushing against her boots, her chin lifted though her pulse beat fast against her throat. Clyde Morrow swaggered into the center of the room, his spurs clinking like rattlesnakes. Behind him came Jesse Pike, younger, sly-eyed, with a grin too thin to hide his hunger. Last was Silas Dunn, broad and heavy, his shoulders crowding the doorway. They moved like men who had learned to take without asking, their hands grazing Ellie's shelves, their eyes restless and mean. The lantern lights stretched their shadows long across the floor, twisting them into wolves. "What's a widow doing so far out here?" Jesse taunted, his voice smooth and cutting. "All alone, no man to keep her company." His gaze swept toward the table where a plate of bread lay. He snatched it, chewing with open mouth, crumbs tumbling down his shirt. Ellie did not answer. Her silence was a wall. She did not flinch, did not lower her eyes. Instead, she stood straighter, her hands folding before her like a woman at prayer. But Jonas was in the shadows. He stepped forward slowly, the scrape of his boots against the floor breaking the bandit's rhythm. His knife was already in his hand, its edge glinting faintly. He did not raise his voice. "Leave her be." Jesse barked a laugh, glancing at Clyde. "So it's true then. She keeps herself a hired man. Or is he just something warmer for the cold nights?" Ellie's jaw tightened. Heat flushed through her, shame pressing down like a weight. Yet she gave no denial. For the first time in years, she did not defend herself to cruel tongues. Jonas's eyes flicked to hers, a tremor moving through him at the insult, but he said nothing more. That silence, unbroken, became a bond between them, stronger than protest, stronger than words. Silas lumbered toward the mantel and plucked the photograph from its place. He turned in his hand, chuckling low. So this was the man. Doesn't look like much. Couldn't keep his land, couldn't keep his life. He smirked, waving the picture as if it were nothing but paper. Ellie's voice cut through the room like a clean blade. "That man built this house with hands you'll never understand." It was the first time she had spoken. The sound of it stopped even Jesse's laughter. Her eyes burned, steady and fierce, and for a moment the house itself seemed to lean closer, listening. Jonas moved then, placing himself between her and the three men. He did not threaten, did not roar. He simply stood there, shoulders squared, the scar on his jaw catching light, his body the line they would not cross. Clyde snarled, and the night cracked open. He lunged first, grabbing at Jonas, but the drifter moved like water, twisting away, blade flashing. A chair splintered, the table toppled, bread scattering across the floor. Jesse lunged in next, fists flying, while Silas swung heavy arms like hammers. The fight was not noble. It was close, messy, the kind of brawl where breath came ragged and blood shone dark in lamplight. Wood groaned under boots, glass shattered. The house itself seemed to tremble. Jonas's knife cut shallow across Clyde's arm, but in the fray he caught a slice along his side, blood blooming through his shirt. Still he pressed forward, not with rage, but with stubborn resolve, every strike an echo of his promise. Ellie stood frozen only a moment longer before her hand moved to the rifle by the hearth. Her fingers found it steady, as though she had been waiting her whole life for this choice. She lifted it, the barrel catching firelight, and aimed with a calmness she did not know she possessed. "Enough," she said, her voice low but carrying. But Clyde rushed anyway, his face twisted with fury. Ellie pulled the trigger. The shot roared through the house, smoke curling into the beams. Clyde fell, the weight of him shaking the floorboards. Jesse's eyes went wide. He stumbled back, cursing, then fled through the broken doorway into the night, his shadow vanishing into prairie dark. Silas lay groaning on the floor, clutching his side where Jonas's blade had found him. The fight was done. The house was quiet again, save for the crackle of fire and Jonas's labored breath. Ellie's chest heaved as she lowered the rifle. The world smelled of smoke and iron. She turned to Jonas, saw the blood seeping through his shirt, and crossed him. Her hands pressed cloth to the wound, her face bent close. For the first time, her touch lingered. He looked at her, eyes dimmed with pain but filled with something deeper, trust, gratitude, the first fragile spark of belonging. She did not speak of love, nor did he. The silence between them said what words could not. When dawn came, Sheriff Caldwell rode up slow, his horse's hooves crunching frost. He dismounted, his eyes sweeping the wreckage, the body, the broken wood, the blood-stained floor. He said nothing at first, only removed his hat, as though offering respect to something larger than law. The town would talk again, of course. They always did. But this time the whispers carried a different weight. They spoke of the widow who had defended her land, the drifter who bled for her, the house that had stood through the night of wolves. Shame had been burned away in gunpowder smoke, replaced by a quiet kind of awe. Ellie sat with Jonas by the hearth, binding his wound with steady hands. The photograph was returned to its place above the mantel, but now another presence lived in the room, a bond not yet spoken but carved deep in silence and in blood. I tell you this because it matters. The prairie does not remember the names of thieves who came hungry. It remembers the ones who stood when the world pressed hardest. It remembers the woman who would not bow, the drifter who chose to protect rather than run. And so should you. Because life will send wolves to your door. Hunger, loss, judgment, shame. You will not always have the words to defend yourself. But strength lives in silence, in the grace of standing straight when shadows close in. That night, the Whitlo house did not break. Neither did the souls within it. And if you carry that lesson, neither will you.